When I was 16, my life took a turn I never saw coming. My mom had married Eddie, my stepdad, 2 years ago. They were both in their 40s, my mom, 40, and Eddie, 42, and their marriage wasn't something I had expected. I was the product of a fling between my parents right after college. A fling they thought would end in a couple of months, but then I came along. My mom chose to keep me, and my dad was involved too, sharing custody of me. So every month, I shuffled between two houses, living with my mom 1 month, then with my dad the next. It wasn't always easy, but it worked. What I didn't realize until much later was how much my parents sacrificed. They both turned down job opportunities and had to stay in the same city, just to make sure I wasn't caught in the middle of a hectic commute between two homes. I wasn't aware of all these things when I was younger, but as I got older, I started hearing about them from my mom, often through Eddie's indirect influence. Eddie wasn't the best stepdad, and to help me understand, my mom would reveal sacrifices she'd made for me. She told me about the men who had fallen in love with her but she had rejected, all because of me. She wanted to focus on raising me, so she didn't have the time for relationships or the complications of balancing work and a partner. She believed that since she had made all these sacrifices for my sake, I should be able to make a small one for her, like accepting Eddie. But the thing is, I didn't ask her to make those choices. She could have ended the pregnancy or let my dad raise me full-time. Yet, I never brought this up. I loved her, and I wanted her to be happy, so I agreed to try and accept Eddie, even though I didn't like him much. And by not liking him, I mean he never seemed to like me. Not that he was cruel or openly hostile, I don't think he's ever been outright rude, but he had this subtle way of treating me like I didn't exist. And that was something I couldn't wrap my head around. I was just 16, a kid trying to figure things out, yet Eddie seemed to harbor this inexplicable resentment for me. It made no sense. I didn't know why he treated me that way, and that's the most frustrating part. What had I done to make him treat me like I wasn't even there? The worst part was that I couldn't even try to fix whatever I might have done wrong because I had no idea what I was supposed to fix. My mom would tell me that Eddie didn't have anything against me, it was just how he was. But I couldn't buy it. If you don't like someone, shouldn't there be a reason for it, especially when the other person is just a kid? It felt like there was some deeper issue, something to do with the fact that I was my mother's first child, or maybe it was just the dynamics of a stepfamily, but whatever it was, Eddie made it clear, he didn't like me. It wasn't always like this, though. In the beginning, he was different. He'd ask me questions, get to know me, even try to have conversations. But then, out of nowhere, it changed. One visit, he was talking to me, and the next, he was acting like I didn't even exist. I didn't know how to react to this sudden shift. I thought maybe it was a one-time thing, just some forgetfulness or awkwardness. But when it happened again and again, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I asked my mom about it. I told her I felt like Eddie was avoiding me, ignoring me when I walked into a room. She told me Eddie was just trying to adjust to the idea of having me around all the time. He hadn't been used to being around kids, he had only dated women without children. But that explanation didn't sit right with me. Eddie had kids of his own. 2 sons, one 15 and the other 12, who had tragically lost their mother. How could he act like I was some stranger in his home when he dealt with a whole family of his own? But I tried to let it go. A few months passed, and I began to accept that this was just how Eddie was going to be. He wasn't going to speak to me. And I had no idea why. Then, after a year of their relationship, my mom and Eddie got married, and Eddie moved into our house with his kids. I had met his sons a few times before, but we never really connected. It was like Eddie had already taught them to avoid me, too. The whole thing felt like a bad dream. Living in a house where nobody speaks to you, where every glance is avoided, and every conversation is carried out as though you don't even exist, how do you survive that? For years, I managed to endure it, like some invisible ghost wandering through my own home. Before Eddie and my mother married, they lived apart. Eddie's mother had been very sick, and he took care of her. But after the wedding, he made a decision that would change everything. He moved her into his sister's house to care for her, and then Eddie, along with his children, moved into ours. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Have any of you ever been in a situation like this? Living with a bunch of people who simply ignore you? Pretend you're not there? It's suffocating. And what made it worse is that I had no idea why. I still don't know what I did wrong. What crime had I committed to deserve this treatment? But at least, for now, I wasn't living with them anymore. It doesn't matter, right? Years went by. I'd gotten used to the silence. Eddie would come over, and as usual, he wouldn't speak to me, just like every other visit. It was like I was living in the same house with strangers who weren't even willing to acknowledge my existence. And no one bothered to explain why. Sure, my mother said she'd spoken to him about it, but she couldn't tell me the reasons, personal reasons, she claimed. Just understand, he's having a hard time, she'd say. But how could I understand something that made no sense? I would try to talk to her about it, beg her to fix it. But when I did, she'd get upset, almost defensive. I've made so many sacrifices for you, she would say. Can't you just deal with this for my sake? I never wanted to argue with her, especially since she'd sacrificed so much to make sure I felt loved and cared for. But this felt like too much. I never told my father. I could only imagine how upset he would be if he knew the truth. He'd probably explode. There were different people with very different ways of raising me, and they clashed often, but this would be a deal breaker. I didn't want to cause any more drama between them, so I kept quiet, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. It had been 3 years since Eddie moved in. 3 years of being treated like I didn't even belong. And I tried to be patient, to accept that this was just how it was. But last month, I hit my limit. I was supposed to spend the month at my mother's house, but things had been tense. Not just with Eddie and his kids, but with some friends at school too. I was in a bad headspace already, and I was barely holding it together. And then, one morning, everything came crashing down. I woke up to find the house empty. Completely empty. It was surreal. The night before, everything was normal, or as normal as it could be. Eddie and his kids ignored me as usual, but no one had mentioned a trip. So where were they? Panic set in as I immediately dialed my mother's number. Where had they gone? What was happening? Her response? "Oh, we're just going on a little trip for the week," she said. "I need you to stay home and look after the house." What? My mother wanted me to stay behind and play the role of the housekeeper while they went off on a road trip? Was I being asked to sit at home alone and watch the place like some security guard? And what about the fact that they hadn't even told me about their plans? Not a single word. They made this decision without me. No consultation. No discussion. I wasn't even given a chance to decide for myself if I wanted to stay or not. Sure, as a high schooler, the idea of an empty house could sound like a dream. I could have thrown a party, invited a few friends, and lived it up for a few days. But that wasn't the point. I was too angry, too hurt by the thoughtlessness of it all. They had just left. The weight of everything had started to bear down on me. The constant feeling of being treated like garbage, like I didn't matter. How did I even last this long? I was in a mess of emotions, fighting with friends, feeling like I had no one to turn to. It was one of those times when life just feels relentlessly awful, and the last thing I needed was to feel invisible in my own home. I had enough. I needed to say something, to make her understand. "You need to apologize to me," I told my mother, my voice filled with frustration. Sure, Eddie didn't want to speak to me, but the bare minimum was at least letting me know that they were leaving. Waking up to find myself abandoned was not okay. But, of course, her response. "You're making a big deal out of this. Just get over it." She didn't even wait for me to argue. She hung up on me, as if I didn't matter at all. I tried calling her back, desperately hoping for some acknowledgement, but nothing. She didn't even pick up. Instead, I got a text, a cold one. I'm trying to enjoy my trip. We'll talk when I'm at the hotel. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine. I grabbed the keys, locked up the house, and hid them under the potted plant like she always did when she left. Then, I left. I left everything behind, every silent treatment, every unspoken hurt, and walked right out the door to my dad's place. When I got to his house, he was surprised to see me. He thought I'd be staying with my mother for the entire month. But I couldn't take it any longer. I had to tell him everything I had been bottling up for so long. Eddie's behavior. The way his kids had been trained not to speak to me. The isolation I felt in a house that should have felt like home. And my mother? She wouldn't talk to Eddie about it. She wouldn't even tell me why he treated me the way he did. She just brushed it all off, saying that he had his reasons, and I should just accept it for her sake. How could I? How could I just let it go? It was suffocating me. And then, there was the last straw. My mother left me alone, just expected me to stay in the house, play the role of the caretaker while she took a trip. Without even telling me. No warning. I didn't know they were going anywhere. I tried to reach her, tried to talk to her, but she ignored me like I didn't matter. I didn't care about her trip. I cared about the fact that I wasn't even worthy of a simple heads up. She could have at least let me know, given me the option to decide whether I wanted to stay or not. But no! And yet, I was supposed to just deal with it. How could I? The hurt was eating at me, and I finally reached my limit. I called my dad. Told him everything. The isolation, the treatment, the lack of respect. I had tried so hard to be understanding, to just let it slide for her sake. But it was getting too much. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I needed him to know what was going on. When I was done, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I started crying. All of it, years of emotional neglect, just poured out. I didn't realize how heavy it had all been until that moment. My dad, though, he didn't yell or get angry. He just looked at me, his expression soft. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll take care of everything. You'll be living with me now." He was upset, but he didn't express it to me. He didn't say anything harsh. He just told me I was safe now, that he'd handle things. I wasn't going to deal with it anymore. He didn't pressure me to return to my mother. He just told me I could stay with him if I wanted. And I did. I did not want to go back. After all the hurt, after all the ignoring, I couldn't stomach the thought of going back to that house. So, I stayed with him, feeling a sense of relief. For 5 days, we didn't talk. Then, she called. I figured it would be an apology, or at least some sort of check-in to see how I was. But no! When I answered the phone, she was screaming. At me. Yelling at the top of her lungs because, get this, she claimed I was responsible for a robbery. Apparently, someone had taken stuff from the house, expensive things. She blamed me for it. She was angry that I'd left. Why? I didn't know. I had called her. I had tried to let her know that I was leaving. But she hadn't picked up. And now, she was turning it all on me. I tried to explain, to tell her I wasn't trying to hurt her, but she wasn't listening. She said I could have texted her. Sure, maybe that was a fair point. But I was so angry, so hurt, I couldn't think straight. Why would I text when everything about that situation felt so wrong? It was too much. She shouldn't have expected me to stay behind in the first place. But that's what it all boiled down to, her belief that no matter how angry or upset I was, I should have stayed. She argued that it was a matter of safety, that she had trusted me, and that I'd let her down. I tried to make her understand, I never asked for this. In fact, I'd done everything I could to warn her, to let her know that I didn't want to stay alone. Yet, she ignored my calls, shut me out. And now, here we were, with her blaming me for what had happened, for the consequences of her own choices. Was I really to blame? I couldn't believe they were all trying to pin it on me, especially Eddie. The first time he spoke to me in years, it wasn't to ask how I was doing or to offer any support. No, it was to yell at me, to accuse me of being careless. His words were a blur, but one stood out. He said he'd always known I'd be the cause of their downfall. How could he even say that? We hadn't even spoken. Where was he getting these ridiculous ideas from? I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care anymore. But the mess didn't end there. My parents were at war, both of them blaming each other for what had happened. My dad thought it was my mom's fault, and I agreed with him. But she, on the other hand, thought it was all on me. She wanted my dad to pay for the damages, accusing him of defending me and making him responsible for it all. I was caught in the middle, unsure of what to do. All she wanted was for me to apologize. She said it would be the only way to make this go away. But how could I? I couldn't do that, not when she was the one who had left me, who had ignored my needs. And I certainly didn't want her to keep dragging my father into this. Was I the one in the wrong for leaving? For choosing to live with my father after she'd gone on a trip with her new family without telling me? 2 weeks passed since the incident, and a lot had come to light. First, I finally understood why Eddie had always hated me. It wasn't just some petty thing. No, it ran much deeper. Apparently, when my mom and Eddie first started dating, he had asked if his mother could move in with us. He wanted her to live with us because she was sick, and while she had a full-time nurse, Eddie thought it would be nice for her to have family around. But my mom wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to live with Eddie, and she definitely wasn't ready to take on the responsibility of his ailing mother. But instead of being upfront with him about her concerns, she took a different route. She blamed me. At that point, 3 months into their relationship, things were getting serious, and my mom, despite all her reassurances to Eddie, wasn't being truthful. She told him that she'd be okay with him moving in, bringing his family, but she made it sound like I was the issue. She portrayed me as some rebellious teenager who had chased away every man she'd ever been with. She painted me as a villain, someone who terrorized her boyfriends because I still held on to the hope that my parents would get back together. She told Eddie that I'd made terrible remarks about his family, that I'd called his mother a burden and threatened to make her life miserable if she moved in. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Those were words I'd never say. I wasn't like that. I knew better. And what really hurt was the way Eddie believed her without ever even giving me a chance. He never questioned her, never gave me the benefit of the doubt, even though I'd always been respectful and kind to him. I didn't find out about this until just a few days ago. Eddie had been pushing my mother to tell me the truth. How had he come to this conclusion about me without ever talking to me directly? Why didn't he even try to understand my side? The betrayal I felt, both from my mom and Eddie, was almost unbearable. The truth has finally come out, and it's completely shattered the facade that had been built around me for so long. Eddie, who had been treating me with nothing but disdain, has finally learned the truth. Everything he thought he knew about me was based on lies. He had been so blinded by my mother's manipulation, and now, after hearing the full story, he couldn't believe how wrong he'd been to judge me. But that's the thing with lies, they tend to catch up to you, no matter how deeply they've been buried. My mother had been lying to him, spinning a narrative of me being the source of all the chaos, all because she couldn't bring herself to admit that the real problem was her own inability to take responsibility. Eddie, in the end, couldn't live with the fact that he had been deceived for so long. And when the truth finally hit him, he couldn't stay with my mother anymore. He couldn't stomach the idea of being married to someone who had been so dishonest with him. The damage was done, and the marriage was beyond repair. He even reached out to me, sending me an email filled with an apology, hoping for forgiveness. But I didn't know what to say or how to feel. After everything, I just needed space to clear my mind. It all felt like a twisted game, and for years, I had been unknowingly caught in the middle. My mother had painted me as the villain in her story, feeding Eddie lies about my behavior, telling him I was a troublemaker, someone who would ruin their lives. She made it sound like I was some delinquent who couldn't be trusted, when in reality, I was just a normal guy. And because Eddie never took the time to actually talk to me, he never saw the truth. Instead, he trusted her lies blindly. Now, the consequences were hitting everyone. My dad was filing for full custody of me, and it was all coming to light. My mother, devastated, was trying to make things right, but her actions spoke louder than her words. You can't destroy a family and then expect to fix it on your own terms. She had destroyed everything, our family, Eddie's marriage, my trust, and now it was all falling apart. As if things couldn't get any more complicated, Eddie filed for divorce. And my mother, in a desperate attempt to salvage something, sent my father a flood of messages begging him to help fix things, to get Eddie to talk to her. She seemed to think that her pleas would somehow erase the damage she had done. But how could we listen to her after everything? She had lied to Eddie, to her own husband, and to me for years. She had thrown me under the bus to protect herself, and now she expected us to fix everything. I couldn't take it anymore. I blocked her everywhere. I had put up with her manipulation for far too long, simply because I wanted her to be happy. But it was clear now, she had never cared about my happiness, only her own. And just like that, it was over. Eddie's divorce was official, and it was all anyone could talk about. My family, their friends, everyone knew. My mother was trying to cope by posting sad quotes on social media, which my cousins kept sending me. It was pitiful. She thought that by airing her grief online, people would sympathize with her, but no one was buying it. The damage had been done. She dug her own grave, and now she had to lie in it. Months passed. My dad had full custody of me now. The battle had been long, but my mother's lies were no match for the truth. Even though her lawyer tried to drag things out, there was no real contest. She had no leg to stand on. And now, I didn't have to see my mother if I didn't want to. Sure, she had visitation rights, but what was the point? I had no desire to speak to her anymore. I was with my dad now, and life was finally starting to feel normal again. I had even patched things up with my friends and was beginning to look ahead. It felt good to move on, to leave the past behind. But the truth? The truth would stay with me forever.